comes from and why it's important. But here's the key where we covered in the intro. Marxism is an ideology. It's a satanic ideology. And last week we talked about Spurgeon and Marx kind of being against one another and speaking about these things and how it's very, very important to understand that. This chapter, this book we're in right now, I'm going to go no glasses because it's shining on me. This chapter that we're in right now, in chapter 1, it really sets up Marx, and it sets up sort of some quotes from him. It sets up sort of some quotes from the Communist Manifesto. And I just want to put this before you because if you don't know the issues about Marxism, I guess what I'm trying to get to is the challenge we have is that it sounds like Marxism is this maybe like other political ideas. You know, hey, you've got Mac versus PC, right? You've got Pepsi versus Coke. You've got capitalism versus communism, right? No, when we say that, we don't understand the sheer overt impact that it has. In other words, lots of things that are considered bugs of Marxism and communism, socialism, are actually features. Things like violence, things like the decay and the destruction of civilization. The premise of this book is a long biography of Marx, and the whole basic idea is that Marxism has worked everywhere it's gone because Marxism's goal is the destruction of society, and Marxism has destroyed society. Last week we talked about the death toll that Marxism has played, and it's the numbers are well over 150 million, probably closer to 250 million people have died because of this ideology. Well, we're going to start tonight with Karl Marx. Let me say a prayer and we'll jump in. So God, thank you so much for this book. Help me to do well as I go through it. Help us to learn from it. I just pray that we would be properly shocked in a good way to understand what you want us to know from it. Use me in the time. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so the chapter 1 is a quote from Marx where he says, "A specter is haunting Europe." Okay, so I'm going to just start reading and kind of and take bits of it. We're going to try to get through all of chapter 1 right now, but I think it'll help. So the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto could not have been more eerily apt. A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism, wrote Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848. So when we say 1848, think about this for a minute, how significant communism and the Communist Manifesto was written. So America comes about in 1776. All right, so 1848, you've got a bunch of other alternative views, but this is sort of the ultimate anti-capitalistic, sort of Western screed in this idea. So they write further, all the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exercise this specter. That's what Marx said about his view. So he was playing the martyr a little bit, that everyone's against him. Marx and Engels opted for such words, a specter, a haunting specter, a specter haunting Europe. Marx and Engels further opted for the word exercise, not in like doing workout, but like when you think of The Exorcist, the process for expunging a demon to describe his own philosophy. The very first image chosen by Marx and Engels to describe their ideology in the opening line of their book is quite telling, if not chilling. Whether it was serious or sarcastic, perhaps even tongue-in-cheek, Marx had a mordant sense of humor, it was nonetheless fitting and prophetic. They were onto something, or something was onto them in their ideology. If ever a force could be described as haunting, or a haunting specter in dire need of exorcism, a phantom unleashed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels fit the bill. The two could not have conjured up a better description of what would play out in the course of history. Now, the problem I have as we go into what I'm about to go into is that it feels like the Matrix. Like all the things I'm going to describe, you're like, this is happening in real life? Like this happened? Yes. Like the giant portion of all the discussions, like the debate right now that's being happened, the presidential debate right now, are debating ideas that are straight up communistic versus capitalistic. The straight up. We mentioned the price gouging last week, but ideas of free speech and hate speech and the ideas of representation, when we talk, these are very Marxist ideas that they come out. We got to understand why they're significant. In this chapter, we're going to take our first look at the contours of Marxism and the man who started it, which is Karl Marx himself. So let's just start here. He says, Marx and Engels viewed the initial draft of their manifesto as a revolutionary catechism for an awaiting world. Catechism's a word we use in church, right? Catholics would use it. You do a catechism class. You learn the teachings and the lessons of your study that you need to know. They're calling this, the manifesto, a catechism for a waiting world. There's a religious undertone in what they're saying. And what I want to get to at the front end, I'll just say this so you understand what you're about to hear, is that Marx didn't just mean to write something that was dry and political. He meant to write something that was an ideology, a religious alternative to Christianity. He truly understood what he was doing as being the opposite, talked about how Satan was the hero, And this is where Marxism comes from. And this is like not, none of this is exaggerated. These are quotes from him as we go through it. But in any case, more than that, they saw their communism as more than the catechism. They referred to it, certainly in the initial draft stage, as Communist Confession of Faith, before opting for the title that stuck, which is the Communist Manifesto. So the Communist Manifesto originally was named the Communist Confession of Faith. This is what's so important about understanding this. Like when we talk about politics that come up as a church, because on the left, that is the left that's Marxist and socialist, their politics is religion, truly. There was a scene recently where a lady at a spice shop sees Kamala Harris and she starts hugging her and crying and weeping, and they call her Mamala and the rest. But the basic idea was, why would you be hugging your politicians? Like, I don't need to hug Donald Trump, right? Like, I have my parents to hug, my children to hug, my wife to hug. You have all these things. But for the leftist, ultimately the communist, this idea, it's faith. And so on the other side, this is the battle that we face, is that the argument is always, no, keep your politics out of faith and keep your faith out of politics. That's the idea, those two things. But I'm like, but on the other side of the aisle, that's not the case at all. The Communist Manifesto was originally, again, the Communist Confession of Faith. At this year's Democratic National Convention, one of the big signs that was up all over the DNC was, keep the faith. It's a big statement here. He says, think over the confession of faith a bit, Engels wrote to Marx in November 1847. I believe we had better drop the catechism form and call the thing Communist Manifesto. Even then, the document was, for these proud atheists, very much a catechisal confession of faith for communists. Their communism became their religion, even as they scoffed at religion as something for superstitious idiots. Truly, their manifesto was and became their catechism, their Bible. This is true today. At a more material level, you could better accuse communism of fashioning a golden calf than channeling an unclean spirit. What they effectively bow down to is just that, the material idol forged and focused on money, property, and gold. It wasn't really about the soul on its front end, but the key to communist Marxist utopia would be economics. But the goal of that was going to bring us into a utopia. That's the idea, was salvation. So what I want you to understand is that every worldview, and we're going to see this tonight and all the way through, worldview is the lens we view the world in. So I just took my glasses off because they were blurry and I looked at the light. These glasses are a lens. They show things in a certain way, and there's a prescription in them, right? And that prescription helps me to see clearly or blurry or however you want to look at it. And so when you think of worldview, we talk about this as presuppositions. It's the lens we look at the world through. And so, for example, critical race theory is a Marxist lens that you view the world through. So if you adopt critical race theory, no one has a class where they start off and tell you, here's why critical race theory is true. No. You start off, you show up at the class, they say, here's your critical race theory glasses, let's talk about your racism. And that's the whole idea of Robin DiAngelo's white fragility. It starts off and says, you're a racist if you're white, and if you say you're not a racist, that's exactly what a racist would say. And then you talk about every issue from the lens of cultural or systematic racism. It's just a lens. There's no argument for it. It's a lens. There's a set of presuppositions, and then we're going to view everything through that lens. So when you watch, Snow White, they're like, oh, there's too much heteronormative, too much whiteness in the movie, even though Snow White is literally a book written about a woman whose skin was as white as snow. Put on the CRT lens. Oh my gosh, there's not enough representation. We're going to find a Hispanic girl to play Snow White. And you're like, why would you do that? And it's the destruction of it. It's the lens that views it this way. Now, the Christian lens that we view things, every lens is made up of basically 3 points, okay? Those 3 points are this. Who we are, or how we got here, like our creation story, what went wrong, and how you fix it. Now, every worldview is encompassed about those 3 things. Okay, so again, how we got here, what does the Bible say? Special creation, made in the image of God. What went wrong? The fall. How do you fix it? The cross, right? That's the Christian worldview. The Marxist atheist worldview, how do you get here? Nothing, goo to you via the zoo, no morality, well then what's wrong with man? And that's where we're going to get into his manifesto. Well, ultimately in Marxism and communism, what's wrong with man is other people have more stuff than me. What's the answer? Take their stuff. There you have it. But it's more than that. Let me keep going. He says, why such an economic goal was ever perceived by any group as the pinnacle of human development is a really good question. To most people, economics and class simply are not that monumentally important. Sure, we care about making money. We want to have a roof over our head, food, financial security. I mean, we want to have the niceties of life, but usually when you see someone preoccupied with money, that's someone that's usually abnormal, right? We say this is a shallow thing. But for most economics ultimately isn't the centerpiece of existence. I mean, especially if you're younger today, most of you in your 20s want to act like you're retired now, and your 20s, good for you, I get it. But to communists and many socialists, this is the alpha and omega. It's the ultimate thing. Now, when I say this, when we talk about money, the love of money being the root of all evil, we tend to think of rich people. By the way, we're all the rich ones in the Bible as Americans. But you could be like in the inner city with no money and be super materialistic and love money to the max. It's all about if money has your heart, if you think about it all the time. And to the communists, they think about money all the time, just not money they make. They think about other people's money. That's truly, no joke, what it's about. They speak as if man truly does live by bread alone. If society says, or if society resolves, say, economic inequality, so let me rephrase their worldview. The idea is that if everyone has different levels of money, so this is, again, why I joked in the sermon a few weeks ago. I said I don't give my kids always fair things. And it's a joke, but you can't study Marxism without seeing it. They say that the reason for fighting is the same thing that the parent says with their kids. If the whole world had the exact same Happy Meal, the exact same toy in the Happy Meal, there'd be no war and fighting. And everyone's like, that sounds like a good idea. They're like, great. So I'm the parent. I'll take everything and divvy out so you all get the same Happy Meal, and there won't be any fighting anymore. That's the argument. It's just really it. And so to get there, you have to destroy a lot of things, because think about what you have to do to get to the point where the government becomes mommy and daddy and they own everything. You don't gradually get there. Right? I mean, like, this is the idea. So how they get to the idea that wealth and what's going on? Well, they basically are operating for a utopian earthly paradise. You know, as Augustine said, we all have a God-shaped vacuum that God alone can fill, not a dollar-shaped vacuum. But to the communists, it's different. Atheists, communists, and socialists have always mistakenly felt that the answers to man's miseries are found not in God, an existence they deny, but in economic materialism. Economic materialism are the answers. It's so ironic that communists and socialists blast the wealthy for being allegedly obsessed with money and material things, when in fact the communists and socialists are even more obsessed with money and material things. They just can't earn it themselves. Communists are also curiously utopians. They're secular utopians, but a utopian is basically an idea of a heaven on earth. For them, an earth without religion. And so what's funny is you think of like the most cringy thing, I'll use the word that my kids have used, cringy thing ever was during COVID when all the stars, not the stars in the sky, but the movie stars sang Imagine on the screen. Did anyone know about this? If you want to find a cringe, just Google it. You can on YouTube sometime. Just COVID, Imagine, movie stars. And they all just took turns. Imagine all. You know, they just go in, like, imagine the world. And the whole thing is imagine there's no religion. You know, there's only peace. And the whole song is communist utopia. That's literally what it is. And we're like, oh, isn't that a great song during COVID when the tyranny of governments was keeping you in your home? It was so sick and twisted if you understood the purpose of the song. Having the stars sing it to you, it's like I wish I didn't know history at that point. I'm like, this is terrifying. Everyone's like, oh, that's kind of neat. They're like, oh. But here's the other irony, is the Greek root of the words utopia, or utopos, or no place. In other words, there is no utopia. It's a no place. It's a place that doesn't exist on earth, not in this world and realm, yet the communists would pursue this no place with religious-like zeal. In his classic, listen to this, Private Property and Communism, written in 1844, Marx grandiosely exclaimed that communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this solution. He says, I've solved mankind's problem in all of history, and I know it. Few ideologies or ideologues have been so boastful. In his German ideology in 1845, Marx fantasized in communist society where no one has exclusive fear of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes. Society regulates the general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. This is a picture of utopia, and the manifesto was a utopian treaty. What do I mean by this? The promise that Marx was making was a promise for heaven on earth. Wouldn't it be great if you could all buy a home? Let's give you $25,000 for first-time home buyers. Wouldn't it be great if everyone was rich? Let's give everyone more money. That's what happened. And what happened? We all got poorer. Because let's stop the people from doing things. Like, that's the economic picture of like selling utopia. Wouldn't it be great if we raised the minimum wage until the robots take over and your hamburger costs $20 now at McDonald's? I mean, so now that's the guy goes, I get more money, I make minimum wage now and it's higher. And you're like, yeah, but now you got to go buy gas. It's so stupid. No one would ever accept it. That's what's so crazy to me. Marx and Engels published their Communist Manifesto in 1848 as the official programmatic statement of the Communist Party or Communist League, outlining exactly what communists believed and planned to pursue. That is what the Communist Manifesto really was. It was a manifesto for the party, which at that point had lacked a single written statement laying out its communist beliefs. Now, the word communism probably preceded, but they popularized it, and here we are. Marx envisioned an apocalyptic revolution leading to the overthrow of capitalism by the impoverished working class, the common people, the masses, the so-called proletariat. Let me say that again. His main picture was an apocalyptic revolution, okay, that comes from the bottom up. Now, why would it come from the working class? Because communism's goal was to make everybody that doesn't have the same amount of power disgruntled. It is a philosophy of covetousness. They say, hey, those guys over there have more than you. Let's all band together and take it. That's the communist idea. It's revolution. And so the proletariat are the people, the have-nots. The stage in the revolutionary process immediately following the overthrow would be that of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That dictatorship would be a way station on the road to the ultimate utopian goal of a classless society. Now, it's interesting because every communistic dictator appealed to the people as a daddy. It appealed to the people not as a funny way, but as like a loving thing. It would constantly be like, look at Stalin, and he's hugging the kids. It would always be a picture of the joyous leader, like love. Look at their love. We all love Stalin, or look his kind eyes looking out at you. And it was always a father figure ushering you in, because remember, the whole idea is the kids are fighting. I'll take away all your stuff so you all get the same Happy Meal. And so you have to make the government, the dictator, as, oh look, it's Mamala, it's Papa Stalin over here, right? That's kind of the idea. The state in the process would eventually be abolished. Apparently, it would die out in this utopian place. It would wither away, and there'd be a classless society. Everyone would be equal, or equitable, right? Class antagonisms would hence disappear, as would conflict, including armed conflict, as would economic inequality, as would social inequality, and peace and harmony would follow. Society would evolve through dialectical stages from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. Now, there's so much I could say about this, but let me just start off with the first one. Even if what they described was good, like the utopian place they describe means you work hard, but you get the same amount that the person that doesn't work hard gets. That's what they're saying. There's heaven on earth. It'll be great. We all get the same amount. It doesn't imply, the problem with it is it has people in it, and people are selfish. And so if you ever had a group project in a class, how many of you have ever done a school class where you had to work on a project with the group before? Let me see some hands. Great. Now, the experience usually is that the workload is not divided up evenly. Usually one smart person does the work, and the other people go out and hang out, and then they say, here, we bought you a brownie or something when it's all said and done. Welcome to communism. Society would evolve, as they said. So note the final transition, though, from socialism to communism. Now, this is one no one ever, like, what's the difference? When asked to define the difference, Marion Smith, director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, likes to say that Christians go to heaven, whereas socialists go to communism. That is indeed the transitionary process, and Smith's language is apt, given that the communist views full communism as a sort of new Jerusalem. The atheistic communist, whether realizing it or not, subscribes and aspires to a messianic vision. And here's the best part, is just out of whole hawk, out of nothing. Moreover, Marx and Engels insisted this wondrous socialism would need to sweep the planet. Now, this is where I want you to pay really close attention to what I'm trying to say. So, like, again, I keep bringing up COVID, okay? I don't want to be political about COVID. Like, what I want you to understand is the global response from nations, places like Canada and Australia that you would think of like our Western, the way they acted and the way that all over the whole world, everyone acted in a certain way, in a very dictatorial way, it really fits into this agenda that Marx and Engels lay out. Notice what they said. They said, the wondrous socialism would need to sweep the planet in order to work. You can't have it in just one country. You cannot have a socialistic America and a capitalistic Europe. Everything has to be socialist or it doesn't work. You don't get to have a choice. In one sense, that's kind of what happened recently with some of the stuff happening during the inflationary cycles after when everyone's economies were starting to open up, right? People were meeting, and the United States was going and talking about corporate tax rates and that. They say, like, let's everyone keep their economies sort of depressed, and we're all going to be happy. But if anyone doesn't play the game and they start winning, America looks bad, everyone else looks bad, and so it's like just waiting who's going to do it, who's going to open up their economy type thing. And so the idea was like, just everyone keep it down. Like, let's all like band together to be bad together, and then we can all look okay. That was the plan that you saw take place at some of the financial things during COVID. But when they talk about the sweeping the planet, he says it has to be worldwide. That was the plan, and it's no small thing. Nonetheless, Marx and Engels, and then Lenin and Stalin, and a train of others still today, right now, felt it could happen. It was the ultimate utopian pipe dream. Stop for a minute and address yourself why. There's some practical reasons why people like open borders, but there's some very communistic reasons why people like open borders. Imagine there's no countries. If you could try. Imagine there's no religion. We're getting into Marxism. And remember, this goes against the Bible's picture that God establishes nations, establishes these things for the restraint of evil. And yet the plan wasn't so dreamy as to lack any specifics, right? It wasn't simply like, we're going to go forward, not backwards, up, not down, turn the page forward. Like, none of it was that. It was actual. There's an actual policy proposal here, and here's the 10-point plan verbatim from their manifesto. Number 1, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of lands to public purposes. The number 1 thing, the first step in the Communist Manifesto, was to eradicate your ability to own any property. The government owns all property. Now you say to yourself, what does that have to do with Christianity? Well, let's get to it for a minute, but the government will just take it from you, right? The government will just take your property. Now, when we talked about last week the idea of taxing unrealized capital gains, that would immediately make that a lot closer to reality than ever before. You can't own a home. Number 2, heavy progressive or graduated income tax. When we say heavy, we mean like 90%. Number 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. The abolition of it means, hey, so my parents have a home. We rent from my parents in that home. When they die, it goes to the state. That's communism. Straight up, period, end of story. Already, there are kinds of taxes that come forward don't fit with the capitalistic system. These things have been infiltrating the American dream for a long, long time. Number 4, confiscation of all property of immigrants and rebels. Anyone that does it, just take their property right away. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. Guys, when the whole thing with the banks failed and the government came behind and into it, and you're just like, oh, this has nothing to do with me as a Christian, it's pure communism. It's the idea that the state is the bank. Now, why does that matter? Because the state gets to dictate what money you get. Number 6, the centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. This is a big one right now. A lot of the hate speech laws are wanting to have the government dictate what is considered hate speech. This is the centralization of the means of communication. We need to ban Twitter. Literally, Elon Musk was threatened by, Australia or somewhere else, or the UK or whatever, for running the Donald Trump interview. And here's a company in another place talking about a U.S. citizen, banning them and making him possibly criminally liable for having his Twitter, which is an open thing. They're saying, no, you can't have this communication. It's harmful to people to interview the previous president of the United States. That's actually harmful. We're going to stop you. The idea is that basically you can, like, for example, think about when the founders founded this country and they said free speech and all the rest. Communism has to be opposed to free speech. Number 7. Oh, and also transportation in the hands of the state. Again, think electric cars are cool, awesome, good for you, they accelerate fast. Why do you think the government loves electric cars? I'm not going to be conspiratorial for a second, but you think it's going to be cheap forever? Wouldn't it be great when we get carbon credits and the government says, well, you can't go on that flight because you drove too far or you used too much laundry? Once all of your energy is from the same source, electrical source, all of a sudden, and it's all capped by the government, they can dictate how many carbon credits you used. They can dictate how far you go based on how much laundry you went or you took too many trips this year. Number 7, the extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state and bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. So it's sort of this environmental idea. The government owns all business and factories, and the government is going to fix the stuff. Number 8, equal obligation of all to work. Everyone's obligated to work equally to do their job. Number 9, gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Do you hear this again? This isn't just being equitable about money, it's equitable about where you live and distributing you freely everywhere, making you move places. Literally concentration camps. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools. Marx and Engels demanded that such a 10-point program be implemented not merely in one nation, but throughout all nations of the world. Many subsequent socialists, beginning with Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks in 1917, worked with that blueprint. Of course, Marx and Lenin and the boys knew that terror would be necessary to implement such a truly radical totalitarian ideology. Again, they knew you'd have to use terrorism and violence. After all, their philosophy demanded an unequivocal rejection of the most basic of human rights, including property. Marx said it this way. Here's a quote from Marx. He says, "The theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property." That's Marx saying this. This isn't me saying Marx is going to lead to that. Marx's statement is, you want to sum up communism and all this, abolition of private property. So when the government says, we want to give you free college, we're like, okay. He's like, give me everything, and I'll let you have some college. That's Marxism. Many Marxists and socialists, and what we're missing about this isn't that we all get to choose who that. It's the idea that, well, I don't want to give it to you. It's like, well, then we have to take it by force. The idea is we're gonna take it. Many Marxists and socialists and democratic socialists today fuss over the extent to which Marx wanted to remove or limit property, but in his manifesto, he and Engels, they doubled down. They weren't hiding the ball. Here's a Marx quote right now. In full, he says this, "You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. In other words, not everyone owns it already, so you don't get it anyways." He goes, in one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That's just what we intend. He wasn't hiding the ball. That is revolutionary. It is radical. It constitutes nothing less than a fundamental transformation of human nature. The idea that you could have property, earn it, like the idea that you can keep, when we say property rights, what we're basically getting to is more than just homes. It is the idea that you get to keep what you earn. Right? I made bread. I sold the bread. You gave me $1. I have the dollar, right? The government's like, what are you talking about? You don't get $1 from selling bread. You sold the bread and we get the $1. But what about me? He's like, yeah, you'll get what I give you. The rejection of such a natural, if not sacred right violates the most basic precepts of all peoples. From the cave to the courthouse, from Judeo-thinking, the most innate urges of primitive tribes, God's commandment, thou shalt not steal, implies a right to property. Like God's basic ideas. You can't take other people's stuff. Like basic in the Bible, 10 Commandments. Marx was not oblivious. When we say this, in other words, Marx wasn't like, I didn't even know I said something against the Bible. He wasn't oblivious to how radical his vision was. He himself acknowledged that his views stood undeniably contrary to the social and political order of things. He understood what he was saying. Communism, he and Engels wrote in their manifesto, not only seeks to abolish the present state of things, but represents, here's a quote, the most radical rupture in traditional relations. So when they talk about Marxism, when BLM is talking about Black Lives Matter, like this isn't about police violence. If you looked at their thing, they said, we stand against police violence and heteronormativity. Like, what does that have to do? How do you just, and capitalism, like you just get to the whole thing, like what? It was just Marxism. They knew what they were advocating. This is the key. This was a revolution. They knew it was revolutionary, and it was going to touch on everything from property to family. Listen to this. Abolition of the family, they wrote with an exclamation point in the Communist Manifesto. Abolition of the family. So again, this is getting rid of all the ties of things that make you human. Look, when you say this, you're like, Matt, this can't be real. When I say this isn't some fringe guy on Twitter saying wacky things. This has been the prevailing sort of view in opposition to capitalism since the mid-1800s. Do you understand that right now? Like this is the giant view that we just like, and it's always sold as, you want free college? Like, yeah! Come in a little further. Again, look at just a few of the specific policy recommendations in the 10-point plan, right? We had abolition of property, a heavy progressive graduate income tax, abolition of the rights of inheritance, so on and so forth. But remember the one we said earlier is a breathtaking call for, first of all, the centralization of a means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. The state gets to dictate where you go. And then number 6, remember, it was a breathtaking call for gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Do you understand that? So communistic ideas were around before Marx and Engels popularized it, put it together. But the idea that we are not a country called America, we're the United States of America. That means that states exist. And remember, the basic idea in the Bible is that God made borders and lands as a way to restrain our evil, to not centralize power. God in Genesis 11 was concerned to take away the centralization of power so that we did not have another Tower of Babel in opposition to him. Borders and lands and separation of lands was a good thing to restrain our evil intention. The communistic idea is, in America, the founders in our country were largely against federalism, like the growth of federalism. The idea is that states' rights should be big and federal rights should be small. That's how the founders envisioned our country, was the idea that the thing that would protect our country from ever becoming despotic, that would protect our country from ever being tyrannical, was to have strong states with their own militia, and that we would all agree essentially to come together. But if you look at most of the conversation right now, for example, even on abortion, the whole thing with Roe v. Wade being overturned, people are like, they're taking away abortion rights. No, Roe v. Wade was literally just put the issue back to the states. Now, the argument on the left is we need to federalize abortion. I want to force America and every state to do it. I want to take away states' rights. Now, I would love to federalize anti-abortion. I mean, I love that because Christ the King's way. We're not fighting for a democracy, a republic, or any other things. We're fighting for King Jesus to come back. But in the meantime, like what we're stuck with is trying to stand against Marxism. I mean, that's kind of, like, this is a thing that matters. He says, listen to this. He goes, chew it over. Marx and Engels and friends want to distribute not only your property, but you yourself, where you could live. They're like, oh, there's too many of you in San Diego. We're going to put some of you in Hesperia. And you're going to be over here. If you're in the military, you're kind of like this. At least in the military, you can kind of pick some options where you might get shipped to, but they can ship you there. What if everyone had to be shipped there all the time? Hey, we're going to move you over here. We're going to move you over here. We want you to live over here. Based on what? You have no choice. Sounds like slavery. If that's not made, like, how would that go right now? Imagine right now in the debate, let's just imagine that there's a candidate up there that says, I want to run on the idea that you guys don't have property, and that I dictate everywhere you go. Give me the power. And people are like, no. And he's like, I took it anyways. We would rise up. No one would be like, you can take my home. You can do this. Like, literally, that's the whole point of the First, Second Amendment. The rest is that we could stop that. We would fight against that ostensibly, you would imagine, except after COVID we didn't. But you would imagine that would but listen to what Marx and Engels said. They willingly conceded that their program would require despotism. Not that it would be, let me say it again. They wrote that it would require it. Not that it might cause it, that it could be a bad effect of it, but they're saying, but again, communism can't happen without despotism. Communism can't happen without tyrants. Communism can't happen without violence. They say it. They're open about it. When you see the Black Lives Matter symbol of a fist in the air, there's a history behind these things. There's a history behind these things. And when you talk about revolution, this is not, it's an ideological revolution. It is revolution, which is death, which is where we got to those 150 to 250 million people dying in these countries through these kinds of revolutions. They said, of course, they said, again, here's a quote from Marx, says, of course, in the beginning, this can't be effected except by means of despotic inroads. Of course it cannot. Human beings would not give up such fundamental liberties without resistance, right? Seizing property alone would require a terrible fight, prompting implementers to use their guns in gulags. This is a vision that necessitates prison camps. Do you understand when people fight for the Second Amendment, they're not fighting because they're fighting for school shootings? That's such a stupid, mean thing. Nobody wants school shootings. What they're fighting is to protect from a government that could decide to shut you down whenever they want. Our founders understood the dangers of these ideas and understood how wonderfully beautiful freedom is, and it's amazing we give it away. His Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and a long line of implementers candidly admitted that force and violence would be necessary. In the close of the manifesto, Marx said this, here's a quote, communists openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Not by the gradual winning hearts and minds, but by the forcible overthrow. Communism is to change what Islam is to conversion. Convert or die. How could it not, though? How could it not be necessary, right? How could this not lead to bloodshed, even terror, and it has over and over again? It would, and with no excuses before, during, or after. In other words, when the bloodshed happens, the communists aren't ashamed of it. They're like, of course that's what's going on. Here's another quote from Marx in May 1849. He says, we have no compassion, and we ask for no compassion from you. When our turn comes, we will not make excuses for the terror. These are threats. Marx said more, he goes on, there's only one way in which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth throes of the new society can be shortened, simplified, and concentrated, and that way is revolutionary terror. Like, who's more fascistic than Hamas? There's a reason that the left likes Hamas. Terror is the means of achieving revolution. And what's the revolution? And this is the thing. When you stop and ask yourself, what could possess an overweight, Ivy Leaguer to join the fatties for Palestine, or the queers for Palestine, or the queers for Hamas, or whatever you want to call it. Like, what would possess someone to say, you know who I would think would be a great person to represent me is an institution that if I went there on a field trip, they'd put me and throw me off a building. No one would be like, that makes sense, unless you start to say, wait, these people represent an oppressed class, and we can overthrow the bourgeois. They're the proletariat. They're living out the same fantasy. We're on the side of Hamas. We're going to be against Israel, the mean, the Jews. We're going to get them. It's familiar, but that's why they would like it, because it's the whole picture of it. It's wicked and evil. I love murdering babies, and I love killing innocent people because of what view is this? This isn't even, I can't even believe this is real. He goes on and says this, emphatically, exclamation point, he writes, socialism cannot be brought into existence without violence and revolution. Pierre-Jean Proudhon, the French socialist, prophetically saw where Marx and his ideas would lead. He viewed Marx as intellectually merciless, pitiless, as the exterminator, he calls him, who was perfectly prepared to let Europe drown in blood if such was the thing required for his cherished theories to be vindicated. And true to his personality, Marx would denounce Proudhon as an idiot worthy of towering disdain and of being crushed, and again, violence would be necessary. To borrow from Leon Trotsky, communist revolutionaries would not arrive at the kingdom of socialism on a polished floor with white gloves. Blood would need to be spilled. The blood of innocence would consecrate the communist ground. Now that sounds crazy to you until you realize when people talk about Hamas, they don't care about Palestinians dying. They actually have said we want Palestinians to die because the more Palestinians die, the more blood that seasons the ground of our revolution or some such nonsense. So now somehow the party opposing them in Israel that's fighting against them is now responsible for the innocent citizens that's not being taken care of by their government, who's hiding behind children. Vladimir Lenin saw his Bolsheviks as glorious. Jacobins were the sick, depraved killers who guillotined some 40,000 people in France over a year in the late 18th century. He compared his Bolshevik faction of his Russian Socialist Social Democratic Labor Party to the Jacobins as Soviet Comintern head Gregory Zinoviev put it, the most glorious of the Jacobins of the time of the Great French Revolution. The Great French Revolution. The Great French Revolution turned into a thing called the Time of Terror and led to Napoleon Bonaparte. Lenin loved the Jacobins. He praised the great, ineradicable, unforgettable things provided by the Jacobins in the 18th century and claimed that the Jacobins gave France the best models of a democratic revolution. It was a terrible model. Lenin, too, knew implicitly that violence would be necessary. He writes, and I quote, "The truth," explained Lenin, a moralistic relativist who saw himself as a supreme gatekeeper of Marx's doctrine, he says, and I quote, "It is no revolution that can be successful unless the resistance of the exploiters is crushed." A few months later, in November 1918, Lenin warned that the Anglo-French and the American imperialism will inevitably strangle the independence and freedom of Russia unless worldwide socialist revolution, unless worldwide Bolshevism conquers. He's speaking about violence, rise up. It's no different than ISIS saying, we're all going to rise up and take down the infidels. As this suggests, Lenin also simultaneously expressed a favorable view of war. He writes, "To reject war in principle is un-Marxist." He wrote in July 1914, knowing full well that Marx himself said the same, averred Lenin, who objectively stands to gain from the slogan peace. In any case, not the revolutionary proletariat. In other words, you can't get Marxism if you don't have war. He reaffirmed this a year later in July 1915. We cannot support the slogan peace since it's totally muddled. It's a hindrance to the revolutionary struggle. So again, when you look at the Hamas and Israel struggle, and you have Hamas, who's truly a communistic view, fascistic is a better word for where they're at, but like their view right now, they don't want peace. They just want to survive, right? They want it, like it's just absurd. They want war. Yeah, so we'll have more to say about Lenin and the Bolsheviks later, but for now it should be clearly understood early on that they, in the spirit of Marx, would not make any excuses for the terror they'd pursue as they harness the specter of communism. Let me say it again. Violence, when it comes to Marxism, communism, and the rest, violence is a feature, not a bug. And so when you hear the ideas, what's scary to me as Christians, we're supposed to know, we're supposed to be wise, we're supposed to understand these ideas. They're not innocent. The rhetoric that you're hearing in our country right this moment, the racial rhetoric, the divide based on people's sexual, like the way people are speaking about you're unpersoning me, you're committing violence against me, thinking the things you think. That rhetoric you can't put back in the box. Truly, I mean, someone tried to assassinate President Trump. He's a threat to democracy. I mean, this is language that's so extreme. It's so extreme. I just want to put ahead, like, the future of America might not be Democrat, Republican. It could truly be revolutionary. This rhetoric is so gnarly. It's always been gnarly, but it's not in a vacuum. It is straight from a place where we can study. Sticking with communism's launch at the stage of the book, it's helped understand Marx's view of what he calls the dialectic of history, which he took up in the University of Berlin as a student. This is the philosophy of guys we've heard already, Greg Wilhelm, Friedrich Hegel, which taught that history is a series of struggles between opposing forces, with each successive struggle unfolding on a progressively higher plane than one that preceded. So what is Hegel's view? Here's your lenses. Everything you look at is a sense of struggle. And that sense of struggle, once you fix it, goes up to a higher plane. So let's put on the lens. We're like, okay, I work at Disney, and I got a job. We're like, yeah, but, I saw, here, I'll give you a good one. I saw this great Babylon Bee article, and it says, there's not enough black women represented as the role of Tom Cruise. What? I just love that. That's literally like just the extremeness of it, right? Like, there's not enough representation of so on and so forth. We don't have enough, two-spirit lesbians on our staff. So there's a conflict, and you're against me, and so we got to fix it. The whole issue with this idea is that every struggle is always a power struggle, and it goes higher and higher into utopia. Ultimately, according to Hegel, and this is interesting when you hear this, human history is a dialectical unfolding of truth. That is truth itself. Okay, ready? Hegel, who started a lot of this, was a Christian. As one Hegel scholar wrote, this dialectical unfolding, according to Hegel, was supposed to end in the revelation of God. Marx even referred to Hegel as a theologian. So it wasn't like he was hiding his Christianity. He was an out-and-out open theologian teaching about Christianity, and there's a lesson here. Bad theology has consequences. Bad theology has very real consequences. But let's keep going. Hegel, bad theology, envisioned a different plane for the struggle than Marx did. His was on ideas, right? Hegel's was an ideational dialectic. Marx's plane wasn't based on the battle of ideas, the so-called ideational plane of Hegel, but one based on economics and classes and materialism. It was dialectical materialism. Though Hegel deeply impacted Marx, trying to understand Hegel's really hard. There's different left Hegelians, right Hegelians, but at the end of the day, the people that won out certainly were the Marxists. Most of the young Hegelians became vocal atheists, and Marx was one of them, and his buddy, and we're going to get into some of Marx's friends and influences early on, was this guy named Bruno Bauer. Like Jack Bauer and Bruno Mars got together. Bruno Bauer. So here's Max and Bruno Bauer and friends, and then we're going to study a couple of their friends. This is helpful to understand Marxism and where it came from, right? So the leading member of the group of Berlin Hegelians that were basically going the other way, right, was Dr. Bruno Bauer, who had a profound influence on Marx. So Marx biographer Jonathan Sperber probably puts it best when he describes the thuggish intellectual Bauer, I like thuggish intellectual, as an unsavory character, the farthest left and most radical of the young Hegelians, an open atheist, an anti-Semite, and a nasty individual. He was arrogant and self-centered to boot, end quote. And he was Marx's best friend. He was his roommate during the formative years, this in his early 20s. Sperber's on spot on when he records that contemporaries saw Marx as Bauer's protege. Bauer became a professor of theology at the University of Bonn, where he specialized more in the finer points of atheism than theology. And this happens all the time. His field of specialty was the New Testament criticism, where he embraced with vigor. So you go to a class, New Testament. Can I start with this? The most satanic philosophies don't begin in satanic places. They begin in crappy churches. And they say that again. The most satanic philosophy the world will ever know doesn't begin in the dark alleys of Satan worshipers. It begins in the crappy churches with bad theology. And here's a guy teaching New Testament higher criticism, which was just German higher criticism, which the whole point was really just to deconstruct the New Testament. His treatise, Criticism of the Synoptic Gospels, denied the historicity of Christ and portrayed the Gospels as fantasy, as mythical inventions. I'm not sure why he would be teaching in a role of theology. His whole point was anti-theology. Remember we talked about, Schaeffer talked about this, the German higher criticism. If you remember back to Schaeffer at all, anyone remember Schaeffer at all? Raise your hand. Okay, remember we talked about the German higher critics? That's what German higher critic was. It was just deconstructing the things you see. Now, look, all the stuff we've done, now you're starting to connect dots, okay? A buddy of Bauer and Marx was another German theological jester named Ludwig Feuerbach, who in 1841 let loose his magnum opus of heresy called The Essence of Christianity. Like, what are you reading? The Essence of Christianity. That seems like a good book. Why would you name it that? Why would you name it? The Essence of Christianity. Here from Feuerbach was another arrogant tome on how man created God rather than vice versa. The essence of Christianity, according to Feuerbach, was man made up God. One of Marx's close contemporaries, Arnold Ruge, who wrote to a friend that Bauer, Feuerbach, and Marx and another associate were forming a dubious band making, quote, atheism their slogan, God, religion, and immortality are cast down from their thrones and man is proclaimed as God. This was a quote from someone back in like 1841. Notice again what they said about Marx and where Marxism started. Marxism started from hatred of this. It is anti-Bible. It is not, it's just an economic system. It is hatred of this. That's again why what you see in the CRT and the sort of stuff you see in the anti-stuff today, it's all to try to de-Westernize, which is all based on this. And so it's a front that it's economic and political. It is just pure satanic opposition to this as a worldview. This is what's so crazy about this. And again, the quote from them is, this is back in 1840s, that atheism was their slogan, God, religion, and immortality are cast down from their thrones, and man is proclaimed God. George Jung, still another contemporary, wrote to Ruge and said, I quote, if Marx, Bruno, Bauer, and Feuerbach came together to found a theological philosophical review, God would do well to surround himself with all his angels and indulge in self-pity, for these three will certainly drive him out of his heaven. Precisely that was in store in March 1841. Bruno Bauer was planning to start a philosophical journal called Archives of Atheism. He wanted to do that with no less than the young Karl Marx as the co-editor, but it didn't go off the ground because they didn't have any funding from any wealthy capitalists. Here's how bad our society is that wealthy capitalists, we're paying universities to teach this to our children. Like we are so much self-hatred and loathing as a country that we're funding Marxist like ideological camps. That's like literally teaching our children to hate family, God, country, and the rest. Like here's another $100,000 a year. But that's exactly what happens. Apparently, a rich atheist socialist willing to share his wealth wasn't found. And so here's what Bauer said. The bitter Bauer moaned that what he really yearned to do is, as a professor, was to preach the system of atheism publicly. Shortly, the professor of Protestant theology was fired from his lectureship in March 1842, eagerly framing himself as a martyr to the atheist cause. So literally, he's in a profession. I just read an article in this book about deconstruction. And deconstruction is happening in this church. It's a big, prominent church that became LGBTQ, and the pastor said, look, I knew I didn't believe in the God of the Bible, but I stayed here and slowly tried to teach people and bring as many people out of the church as I possibly could. This was a quote from this guy, and the book is called Deconstructing Christianity. Think about how that's literally like what the Bible says. They're blots and blemishes. They're hidden reefs at your feast. It's talking about like a pastor of a big, prominent church. Bauer and Marx had more antics up their atheist sleeves. After a parting shot in anger after his dismissal, Bauer enlisted Marx in what biographer Jonathan Sperber called a public atheist provocation. So on Easter in 1842, Bruno and Karl went to the nearby village of Godesberg, which was a favorite excursion site from Bonn, and they rented donkeys and rode them through the village in what was a direct and deliberate parodying of the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem. The incident says Sperber would spread word by word of mouth, and they would fondly talk about it. A biographer talks about this is the kind of thing that he admired, but he says in 1841, Marx went to stay with Bruno, Bauer, and Bonn, where the two reprobates spent uproarious summer, shocking the local bourgeois, getting drunk, laughing in church, galloping through the city streets on donkeys. He's describing them. That sounds more like just a bunch of young guys getting into trouble, going on a PB. No, they were reenacting Jesus' ride into the triumphal entry to mock God. Does that sound like a guy who's just having a good time? There's another couple things. He's just a weird dude. I'm going to pass some of his weird stuff. It's not relevant. There's another guy that we know, one of his allies, named Bakunin. Another atheist ally of Karl Marx was Mikhail Bakunin, 1814 to 76. He's a Russian atheist and a revolutionary socialist anarchist, and he was definitely a wild man. The two would later split, but they first met in Paris in the 1840s and hit it off. Why is this relevant? Well, here's what Bakunin talked about in one of his books called God and State. He writes this. Yes, the whole history of humanity, intellectual and moral, political and social, is but a reflection of its economic history. Marx would applaud that totally, as he would Bakunin's opiate-like caricature of religion. Maybe Bakunin's worst and most well-known phrase about God and religion is the one from God and the State. He says, if God existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. You hear that right? If God existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. Bakunin had a nasty, angry, cynical view of God and religion, stating that religion enslaves, debases, and corrupts, and that all religions are cruel, all founded on blood. Now, you know what's fascinating about this statement? And this is one of the things I've noticed over the last, I've been studying the Bible since 2002, like very seriously since 2002. I started like really paying attention to like kind of politics and history really pretty heavily in 2012. I started getting really interested after sort of the debacle of the Mitt Romney campaign. I didn't want to vote for Mitt Romney because he was Mormon. I didn't want to like give Mormonism a platform. But then watching sort of how they made Mitt Romney look like this terrible, I'm like, this is so wicked, it's so crazy. But since then, watching the criticisms that you happen in politics, there's a lot of this weird idea of accusing your opponent of the very thing you're doing. You see it all the time. So literally, this is a true story that's happening right now. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the rest, used the Justice Department to essentially try to put Trump in jail, right? That's what they say. They want him to get jail time. They're using law to bring up these crazy things to like accuse him of crimes. It's never happened before in an American country because it's so corrupt, right? But here's the part that I want you to pay attention to, and this is the part I want you to be smart for a minute, okay? They're literally trying to jail their political opponent. And all the headlines and all the talking points from all the people in the site were saying this, man, we got to stop Trump because he's a threat to democracy because he's threatened to jail his political opponents. No one bats an eye. Like literally, they're doing it right now. And so you got to stop him because he's going to do that. And you're like, wait, is this going? And you're like, that seems so crazy. Why would you just say the opposite? Like that's crazy, right? Bauer back in the day, look at what he describes about religion. Now, what do we say? Communism only comes about through bloodshed. It is the destruction of all private property, the destruction of things, of moving you around. Like it takes away everything. It leads to misery. He says, what's about religion? He says, it enslaves, debases, corrupts. It's cruel, founded on blood. Isn't that exactly what you made up? Curiously, it wasn't so nasty, angry, cynical to Satan, who he calls the eternal rebel and the first free thinker and emancipator of worlds. The glorious rebel view of Satan isn't unusual among radical socialists, as we'll see later. The guy like Saul Alinsky, who framed Satan as the first radical who rebelled against the establishment. The latter passage in Bakunin's God and State is worth quoting a little bit more at length. Listen to this. He writes, yes, our first ancestors, our Adams and our Eves, were, if not gorillas, very near relatives of gorillas, omnivorous, intelligent, and ferocious beasts endowed with a higher degree than the animals of other species with two precious faculties, the power to think and the desire to rebel. What's the number one thing that makes you awesome? Your creation myth. The Bible, he writes, which is very interesting and here and there a very profound book, when considered as one of the oldest surviving manifestations of human wisdom and fancy, expresses this truth very naively in its myth of original sin. Jehovah, who of all the gods, good gods adored by men, was certainly the most jealous, the most vain, the most ferocious, the most unjust, the most bloodthirsty, the most despotic, the most hostile to human dignity and liberty. Jehovah just created Adam and Eve to satisfy we know not what caprice, no doubt to while away his time, which must weigh heavy on his hands in his eternal egotistic solitude. Or he might have some new slaves. He generously placed at their disposal the whole earth with all its fruits and animals and set but a single limit to their complete enjoyment. He expressly forbade them from touching the fruit of the tree of knowledge. He wished, therefore, that man, destitute of all understanding of himself, should remain an eternal beast, ever on all fours before an eternal God, his creator and master. He keeps going. Here's what he says. But here steps in Satan, the eternal rebel, the first free thinker and emancipator of worlds. He makes man ashamed of his bestial ignorance and obedience and emancipates him. That means he sets him free, stamps upon his brow the seal of liberty and humanity, and urging him to disobey and eat the fruit of knowledge. Well, I just don't want to miss what's going on. This guy is one of contemporaries. Marx copies him. His basic premise is that Satan's the good guy. And if you look at all the pictures and calls for freedom right now in our country, from a lot of people, but particularly from one political side of the aisle, the freedom that's in view is the autonomy that was sought by Adam and Eve in the garden as they rebelled against God. We took the wonderful nation that was found on the idea of freedom and made that freedom into the rebellion of Satan. And every time we talk about the me first, me, we're just encapsulating the same. When I say this is the doctrine of demons, and the Bible says we're spiritual warfare is against doctrine, that's literally what we're talking about. Like this is the doctrine of demons. Satan's a good guy. He wants to emancipate us and set us free. Like, how much more doctrine of demons do you want? Like, I don't understand how much more demonic you want to get. He goes on, though. He says, we know what followed. The good God whose foresight, which when the divine faculty should have warned him what would happen, and God came into a terrible, ridiculous rage. He cursed Satan, man, the world. Basically, he goes on. I didn't want to read it. It just goes on and on and on and on, how God's greedy and God's bad. This is as blasphemous as it gets. That's why I don't want to repeat it anymore. It's just blasphemy, blasphemy, blasphemy. And it's so stupid, too. It's so dumb. Like this guy in his stupid little turtleneck wouldn't stand up and actually defend his view from the Bible. He's probably didn't wear a turtleneck, but like, listen to his last quote of this stuff. He says, they call religion civilizing the people, but it's not plain that these governments and those are systematic prisoners. They're stupefiers of the masses. He goes on. He keeps ranting. Let me get on a tiny couple quotes. He says, I've wandered, writes in his writing, he goes, I've wandered from my subject because anger gets hold of me whenever I think of the base and criminal means by which they employ to keep the nations in perpetual slavery. Undoubtedly, they may be better able to fleece them. Talking about religion. Of what consequence are the crimes of all the Trotmans of the world compared with this crime of treason against humanity committed daily in broad day over the whole surface of the civilized world by those who dare call themselves the guardians of fathers of the people? I return to the myth of original sin. So he's doing the same thing. So this is what I want you to see. The argument, Trump's a threat to democracy, and you're like, whatever. The argument is the same argument used towards you by the Marxist, that you're a threat to society, that you're a threat to every law that's passed that tries to enshrine LGBTQ stuff says your speech is a threat to their well-being. Your Second Amendment is a threat to their, your ability to feel safe, and you could go down the line. And this idea is the idea that we got to overthrow it. It's a threat. It's a bad thing. He goes on. He says God admitted Satan was right. It's just so much blasphemy. I'll keep going. He says, let us find. I'll end right here. He goes, let's now disregard now the fabulous portion of the myth and consider its true meaning, which is very clear. Man has emancipated himself. He has separated himself from animality and constituted himself as man. And he's begun his distinctively human history and development by an act of disobedience and science. This is rebellion and by thought. All right, let me stop for a second and stop and think. When I said that Marxism starts with atheism, isn't that funny? When you think of atheism, you think of everything came from nothing. And yet they say, nope, we came from God and Satan set us free. You're like, you can't make this up. You're like, that sounds like a stupid idea. First of all, why be a Satanist? You're like, okay, now I believe God and Satan exist, but I'm choosing Satan's side. What a stupid thing to do. This is one of Marx's early admirers. Marx loved him, and so let me get to Marx now and we'll end, okay? The most infamous of Karl Marx's remarks made on religion was his demeaning assessment of religion, where he called religion the opiate or the opium of the masses. It's the delusion of the masses. So I'm deluding you right now, apparently. Few, however, are familiar with the wider context of what he said, right? And so let's just take a section in full. This is from his manifesto, okay, written in 1944, or 1844, I'm sorry. 4 years before his manifesto, rather. This is what he wrote before that. He says, I'm going to quote portions of it, and I quote, man makes religion, religion does not make man. Religion is indeed the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. But man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, state, society. This state and this society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world because they are an inverted world. What he's saying is that man was free. This is the Rousseau. This is the stuff we said before. And that religion is there to oppress you. Notice what he says next. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of a soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Notice this is not economic language. This is religious language about the meaning of man. And that what you're learning from the Bible is enslaving you. This isn't just I just don't believe the Bible. It's I hate the Bible. He goes on. The abolition of religion is the illusory happiness of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for the real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their conditions is to call on them to give up the condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore an embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears which religion is a halo. Criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that man should continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation, but so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. The criticism of religion disillusions man so that he will think, act, and fashion his reality like a man who has discarded his illusions and regained his senses. And here he goes on, so that he will move around himself as his own true sun. Religion is only the illusory sun, which revolves around man as long as he does not revolve around himself. Now stop for a second. Think about this, what I'm saying. All of the narcissistic self-esteem movement, Marxism sounds economical, it sounds over here. all of the, I feel like this, my emotions are here, my happiness, me, all the psychology culture, all the selfish kind of culture you look at, that is the essence of Marxism. Marxism begins with self being God. Again, notice how he says it again. Man's goal is to move around himself as his own true son. Speak your truth. And religion's just an illusory son, which revolves around man as long as he doesn't revolve around himself. Now contrast what he just said with Jesus, who's like the Bible says that Christ is to be preeminent, that all things are done for the glory of God, not the glory of man, where Jesus says, deny yourself and follow me. Let me say this, a Christian cannot believe this. This is as antichrist as it gets. And so here's the problem, and I just want to keep saying this, okay? The seemingly innocuous evangelical church movement that takes every Bible story and makes it a story about your happiness, success, and whatnot is as Marxist as it comes. It is straight from the pit of hell. And I want you to understand that, because you go to the Bible and someone takes the Bible and they stand up to preach you a story, and the Bible says that Jesus was, they saw the disciples and they're fishing and they weren't catching any fish. He says, throw the net on the other side. He goes, have you ever had a time where you weren't catching fish? Maybe at your job, you weren't getting that promotion. Well, throw the net on the other side. That is straight Marx. It's about you. It revolves around you. That God has to think, this is straight satanic. I'm like, well, they quoted the Bible. It was great. They had great music. I like the music. God help us. Marx next used 3 crucial words he would also give in the Communist. He talked about the abolition of religion. I mean, the idea, like, notice how he says, given what he said about the previous line, right, it wasn't surprising the abolition of religion is necessary for people to achieve real happiness, especially given that they're clinging to religion, to borrow a description from Barack Obama, who in 2008 spoke sneeringly of Americans clinging to their God as mere illusory happiness. Obama was very much a Marxist. Very much a Marxist. Man, said Marx, must throw off the chains of imaginary flowers. He must discard his illusions and regain his senses. Why? So that he will move around himself as his own true son. That's the idea. Religion's just stopping you from doing this, right? This is all just relativistic pablum. It's just stupid. It's sophistry. And it's evolved into the modern secular progressive zeitgeist that dominates America and the wider West today. Let me say this again. The author's not going far enough. This has evolved in the modern Christian, zeitgeist that dominates the church today. You go to any Christian, you go in the Amazon, and you go in the Christian section of books, and it's all about you. Joel Osteen wrote a book called The Power of I Am. And you thought, man, that's a theological, Joel Osteen might be crazy, but he wrote The Power of I Am, and I am is the name of God. He goes, no, he means the power of I am. He's talking about you. What's more like this than that? This is the power of I am. Like, he literally just took the name of God that made people fall down before Christ. And he's like, it's about your power. Like, when man makes himself his own son, his own God, he destroys the world. As ex-communist Whittaker Chambers observed, Marx and his minions were merely echoing the first mistake of man, initiated way back in the garden, you shall be as gods. Marx finished his destructive passage with an exhortation to history, philosophy, law, policy, and he said that he wanted to establish the truth of this world, and that would be obviously Marxist truth, which is what? You shall be gods. It's crucial to realize that communism, being a totalitarian ideology, endeavored to change human nature itself. It's clear through his writings. In the German ideology in 1845, Marx and Engels said that in order for the widespread generation of this communist consciousness and for the success of the cause, it's necessary that man himself should suffer a massive change. This was a change, they said, that could only come through a practical movement, a revolution. There must be a little process of overthrowing the old, and here he says, filthy yoke and founding a new society only in a revolution. Human nature itself had to be changed. There had to be a fundamental transformation of human nature, a revolution of human nature. And so today's transgender movement is the ultimate prize in cultural Marxism. In that framework, though, religion was viewed as dangerous, ubiquitous revival belief system. It was holding us back, and it was Marx's chief competition for the mind of the working class. The Soviet leadership would want Marxism and the state to be central to all citizens' lives. No, you can't have loyalty to something over the state. Hence, the words of the Communist Manifesto were to be read, learned, drilled, memorized, eternalized. Any challenging text, especially an influential one like the Bible, was unwelcome. Religion was perceived as an ever-present powerful enemy, not to be taken lightly. I just love how communists recognize how powerful the Bible is, and we don't even read it. Not you, but just as Christians, in general. It's like there's an entire culture built around reading devotionals with half a verse out of context and how you feel about it. Marx promised nothing less than the creation of a new world. His generation pretended to, and he quotes, he says, resembles the Jews whom Moses led out of the wilderness. It must not only conquer a new world, it must also perish in order to make room for the people who are fit for a new world. Let me just say this. In 1 John, John talks about antichrists among us. So antichrist, Marx is an antichrist. Not the antichrist, but he's definitely an antichrist. He's presenting a false view of heaven. It's so crazy when you say that, because you're like, I just thought we were talking about economics. Nope. The kind of a utopian idealism common to the communist left, and even much of the wider left right now, which otherwise proudly touts its cynicism and suspicion, is 100% religious. It has all of its hope in a centralized government that's going to corral and herd the collective masses. And you can take the hardest left-wing pessimist, and they'll morph into the most hopeful idealist when they get power. Leftists scoff at the Baptist preacher clinging to his Bible, right? And they're the ones that are the most religious of all, the most fundamentalist of all. You could be in this church, and you can doubt the things I say, and we can have a conversation. You can't doubt the orthodoxy of the left and even have a conversation. That's heresy. You're out of here. You could be in this church and doubt what I say, and we'll have coffee with you, and we'll talk, and we'll persuade one another. You cannot even doubt. You can't even talk about it. Out. That's more fundamentalist. And you say to yourself, well, that's just, that is fundamentalist ideology. It is a more fundamentalist religion than what we're actually practicing right now. That's crazy. Marx wasn't even impressed with Christianity even. He says the social principles of Christianity, not just the Bible, preach cowardice, self-contempt, abasement, submission, humility. George Jung, a Marxist contemporary, a young lawyer and a member of the Doctors Club, said that Marx, quote, calls Christianity one of the most immoral religions. Jung viewed Marx not as a political revolutionary, but a theological, philosophical revolutionary who was attempting to overthrow the entire social system, not just an economic system. Look, everything we just said tells you much about Marx and the religious question, but where do you start? We're going to get to that next week. But just now to kind of sum it up, and we get to like more of his biography, this is hard stuff to swallow. But when I try to tell you, like, when people repeat slogans and they're ignorant of it, I'm not telling you need to jump up and be like, communist! But if you don't understand why it's wrong to take other people's money that you don't belong to you, and you have to use a sort of a political lens to say that's wrong to do that, what Bible are you reading? If you have to think it's, that the government has the power of God, I'm like, remember what happened when Pharaoh thought he was a god and God overthrew him? Remember what happened when Caesar said he was a god? And remember what happened when one of the Herods said, the voice of a god and not a man, and God made worms eat his stomach and he died in front of them? God hates this posturing. Remember when Sennacherib went against Hezekiah and he made fun of the God of Israel and said that your gods won't help you? Sennacherib, Hezekiah got rid of all your gods and has only one. Now I'll definitely defeat you. And God just humiliates him and has him go home and his own sons murder him. God hates this stuff. He's going to overthrow it. My call isn't for us as Christians to go out there and have an anti-communist revolution. Like I said, vote, do all that stuff. But let me say this. Communism attacks the nation and the state precisely where I've said every single week. I've said every single week. I don't want to miss it. But there's one area tonight that I've hit on a little bit, and that's knowing your Bibles. Guys, the Sermon Sunday scared me a little bit, where entire generations just, like, what is Phariseeism? What is legalism? Remember, Jesus' main criticism to the Pharisees was not, you guys are so strict. We got to love people and be less strict. That's not what he said. His constant refrain to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were the teachers, was, have you not read? Now, why is this a big deal? Let me redefine. Legalism, Phariseeism, is not being strict in your faith. It is being bold in your faith without this. And so all the folks that are part of an evangelical world where they talk about Jesus, they're into Jesus, they love singing about Jesus, but they refuse to pick this up, they're in a dangerous place at the very, very best. I'm not trying to be a jerk, but we have to know this book. The Bible promises to be an amazing book. I also think it's amazing that Marxists and leftists in general understand the power of the family, and the power of this book. They oppose this book at every turn as dangerous. If it's dangerous, if this book is dangerous, why are churches doing At the Movies series for sermons? If this book is so important, why are pastors doing constant sermons about sex and relationships all the time? Guys, we live in a generation of unbelieving pastors shepherding goats, and I'm not trying to be mean, but we're here right now. Just wake up, please. Let me pray. God, use tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next week.
This is Pastor Matt Smith, Senior Pastor of Barabbas Road Church. For the past 16 years, it has been my joy to equip the saints for the work of the ministry by preaching the Bible verse by verse, line by line, the whole counsel of God. Our audio and video messages have reached over 158 countries and are listened to by over 5,000 people each week. Many of you who listen weekly have been through our doors, and I'm thankful that you continue to use us as a resource for your enrichment and edification. We consider you all a part of our extended church family. As you know, San Diego is a spiritually dark and financially difficult place to exist as a local church, and yet, by God's plan and purpose, He's placed us here to boldly challenge the false faith by teaching that Jesus is the only way, truth, and life. My desire is that we would continue to be a bastion of light in this dark area, that we would keep bringing you consistent biblical teaching on a weekly basis. To that end, I'm asking that you would prayerfully consider partnering with us in your missions giving. To do so, go to Barabbas.com/give. I'm thankful for this task and look forward to our partnership for years to come.